2 security guards watched me carry 26 years of my life out to my truck in 4 cardboard boxes on a Tuesday afternoon in the rain. I was 58 years old, and I'd built half of that company with my own 2 hands. That night I called my brother. Straight to voicemail. I called my mother. She said she'd call me back from book club. She never did. 61 days went by like that. 61 days of silence from every single person who shared my last name. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in May, my phone finally rang. It wasn't my brother apologizing. It wasn't my mother explaining herself. It was a woman named Paula Simmons, a senior underwriter at a bank in Columbus, asking me a question that would end up unraveling 7 years of lies my own family had built around a piece of paper they thought had disappeared a long time ago. Welcome to Dark Revenge. This is the channel for the people who got pushed out quietly and came back louder than anyone expected. Not with shouting, but with paperwork, patience, and the truth sitting exactly where somebody left it. We tell real feeling stories about toxic families, sibling betrayal, workplace cruelty dressed up as a business decision, and the quiet ones who spent years being underestimated right up until the moment they weren't anymore. If that's the kind of story that keeps you up past your bedtime, go ahead and subscribe now, because what happened after that phone call is not something anyone in my family saw coming, including me. My name is Margaret Colton. Everyone at the plant just called me Meg. For 26 years, I was vice president of operations at Colton Fastener and Supply, a manufacturing company on Foundry Street in Marion, Ohio, that my father built out of a 2-bay garage with a used lathe and a bank loan he was terrified he'd never pay back. I wasn't a desk person. I was on the shop floor by 5:45 most mornings, steel-toed boots, safety glasses pushed up on my head, walking the line before the first shift even clocked in, because that's how my father taught me to run a plant. You learn a machine by standing next to the person who runs it, not by reading a summary about it in a meeting. I knew the names of every operator's kids. I knew which press was going to act up before it actually broke down. I'd been widowed 4 years earlier. My husband Frank had a heart attack in our kitchen on a Sunday morning while I was at church, and after that, the plant and my 2 grown children, Claire and Nathaniel, were most of what I had left that felt solid under my feet. I wasn't chasing anything big. I liked being the person who kept things running. I liked being useful. That probably explains why what happened next hit as hard as it did. To understand why the silence cut the way it did, you need to understand what it was like growing up a Colton. My father started that company from nothing, and my older brother Richard, everyone called him Rick, was 2 years ahead of me, and from the day I can first remember, the plant was always going to be his. Not because he loved it more, because he was the son. I was sweeping metal shavings off that floor at 16 while Rick sat in on supplier meetings at 19, wearing a tie he genuinely did not know how to knot correctly. I earned a mechanical engineering degree from Ohio State, top of my class, and came home to run production because I actually understood what made the machines tick. Rick got a business degree, he barely finished, and the title of company president by the time he was 30. My father used to say it at the dinner table like it was scripture. A business needs a name to carry it forward, and that name has to be a Colton man. I stopped waiting for him to notice the irony that I was the one actually carrying it every single day for half my life. I told myself it didn't matter, that I did the work because I loved the work, not because I needed anybody's approval. Mostly that was even true. But there's a particular kind of tired that comes from being essential and invisible in the same building, year after year, and I've been carrying that tired a long time before this past March ever rolled around. It happened on a Friday. An HR coordinator I had personally hired called me into the small conference room at 2 in the afternoon. My badge had already stopped working on the side door. I found that out walking in, which tells you something on its own. Rick wasn't even there. He sent his operations director instead, a man I had trained myself from scratch 3 years earlier. Position eliminated due to restructuring, effective immediately, 6 weeks of severance. Please gather your things today. That was the entire conversation. 2 security guards, the same 2 who used to wave me through the gate every morning at 5:45, stood there while I packed 26 years into 4 cardboard boxes I found myself in the supply closet. It was raining when I carried the last box out to my truck. Nobody offered an umbrella. I sat in the cab in that parking lot for 11 minutes before my hands were steady enough to drive home. My 30th anniversary with the company, The date my father always circled on the kitchen calendar every single year without ever once explaining why, was 17 days away. I called Rick that night. Voicemail. I called my mother, Ellen. She told me she was at book club and would call me back. She never did. I sent one message to the family group chat. Rick, my mother, Rick's wife Patricia, everybody, just asking if anyone knew why this had happened with no warning at all. Delivered. Eventually read. Not one single reply. I told myself people freeze up around bad news sometimes. I gave it a week. Then 2. 3 weeks after I lost my job, my mother turned 80, and Rick hosted the dinner at his house on Blackthorn Lane, the way he always did for the big birthdays. I almost didn't go. I went anyway, because she's my mother, and because some part of me still wanted to believe the silence had a simple explanation. It didn't take long to feel how wrong that hope was. Nobody at that table mentioned my job. Not once in 3 hours. Not my mother, not Rick, not Patricia, not one of the cousins who usually can't resist asking about work. Rick gave a toast thanking, in his words, everyone who's helped keep this family and this company strong, and his eyes moved around that entire table and skipped over me like I was a chair nobody had bothered to pull out. Bradley, Rick's son, spent most of dinner talking about the new boat he'd just put a down payment on. I remember doing the math in my head without meaning to. 3 weeks. When I went looking for the bathroom, I passed Rick's home office, door left open a few inches, and saw a thick manila envelope sitting square in the middle of his desk. The label on the tab read, Meridian, Colton, NDA. I didn't know what that meant yet. I just knew nobody had mentioned it to me, and on my way back to the table, I heard Patricia lean toward a cousin and say, in that soft, concerned voice people use when they want gossip to sound like compassion, things have just been so hard for Meg lately, with the adjustment and everything. I hadn't said one word to her about how I was adjusting to anything. She'd already decided the story for me and handed it out to the family like party favors. I drove home from that dinner and didn't sleep much. The following Sunday, I drove past the plant just to look at it, and there was a new construction permit posted on the fence. A 6-figure loading dock expansion, greenlit fast, for a company that had just told me, in one conversation, it needed to cut costs by eliminating my position. 3 weeks after that, a woman I knew from the diner on Main Street mentioned, just making small talk, that Bradley had been promoted to Vice President of Strategic Operations. My old title, more or less, with different words stacked in front of it. I sat in my truck outside that diner for a long time. Something about the whole shape of it didn't sit right in my stomach, and I've learned over 58 years to trust that particular kind of unease when it shows up. The first real crack came from Carol Jennings. Carol had kept the books at Colton Fastener almost as long as I'd run the floor, and in all those years, she'd never once been anything but careful and quiet. She called me on a Tuesday night from a number I didn't recognize. Her voice lowered like she thought the walls in her own kitchen could hear her. Meg, she said, I probably shouldn't be doing this. Then she told me she'd come across an email in an old shared folder, sent by Rick to HR 2 months before I was let go. The subject line read, Colton reorg timeline, must be finalized before March 3rd. My anniversary was March 23rd. 20 days, not 17, I'd realize later, but close enough that the coincidence stopped feeling like one. Carol also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the company had been meeting for months with some group out of Cleveland. She didn't know what it was about. Neither did I. Not yet. But I remembered a manila envelope on a desk with the word Meridian printed across the tab. I called an employment attorney named Renee Castillo the next morning, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. Renee had a small office above a shoe repair shop downtown, and a habit of asking questions that made you realize how much you actually remembered without knowing you remembered it. She asked if there had ever been any kind of profit sharing or ownership arrangement tied to length of service at the company. I told her I didn't think so. Then, almost out of nowhere, I remembered something my father used to say under his breath after a couple of bourbons at Christmas. Taken care of, no matter what. I hadn't thought about that phrase in years. I drove out to see my mother alone the following week, without telling Rick I was coming. She looked smaller than I remembered, sitting in the guest cottage on Rick's property, where she'd lived since my father's stroke 7 years earlier. She wouldn't meet my eyes at first. Then she told me, quietly, that there was a safe deposit box at the bank on Center Street, still in both her name and my father's, and that she hadn't opened it in years because she was afraid of what she'd find. I asked her why. "Because your father put something in there for you a long time ago," she said. "And Rick has never known about it. And if he finds out I helped you get it, I don't know what happens to me here." I understood, right then, exactly why she'd stopped answering my calls. She hadn't chosen Rick over me. She'd chosen whichever one of her children controlled her rent. Inside that box was a single typed letter, 1 page, 30 years old, the same month I'd come home from Ohio State to work at the plant full-time. My father's signature sat at the bottom of it, strong and certain, the same signature that used to sign my birthday checks. The letter stated, in plain enough language that even I didn't need Renee to translate it, that any Colton family member who reached 30 years of continuous full-time service to the company would automatically vest a 24% equity interest in Colton Fastener and Supply, non-forfeitable, regardless of title or position, so that, and I've read this next part probably 40 times sitting in my truck outside that bank, loyalty is rewarded on its own merit and not on the strength of a person's name. He wrote that the year I came home. He wrote it for me, and he never told me, because telling me out loud would have meant admitting something to Rick he never found the nerve to say. I brought the letter straight to Renee. She read it twice, then asked me one question. Had anyone ever mentioned an amendment? I told her no. "Then let's go find one," she said. "Because if this letter still stood on its own, you'd have been seeing statements about it for years. And you never saw a single one. It took her firm 11 days and one formal document request to find it. 7 years ago, 3 weeks after my father's stroke, while he was still an inpatient at Marion General, a document titled First Amendment to the Colton Family Equity Letter had been signed. His signature on it looked like a child's handwriting, the letters barely connecting, the pen pressure so light in places it was almost a scratch instead of a signature. It replaced the automatic 30-year vesting clause with something called discretionary recognition, granted at the sole judgment of the company's president. The president, by then, was Rick. The notary on that document was Gordon Pruitt, the same attorney who'd handled Colton family business since before I was even born. 3 weeks after a stroke, in a hospital bed, nobody had asked me a single question about any of it, then or in the 7 years since, because as far as my family knew, I had no idea the original letter had ever existed at all. If you've ever watched someone quietly rewrite the story of a person who couldn't speak up for themselves anymore, you already understand why I didn't say one word to Rick, and just kept every single page Renee found instead. This is exactly the kind of story this channel exists for, the ones where the truth takes its time getting there, but never actually disappears. If that's what you come here for, go ahead and hit subscribe, because we are nowhere near the real twist yet. Renee requested my father's hospital records from that October using a healthcare proxy form he'd signed years earlier that had somehow never been formally revoked, one that still listed me as a secondary contact. The attending neurologist, a Dr. Farouk Ansari, had written a clinical note dated the exact same day the amendment was signed, describing my father as close to word for word, exhibiting acute confusion and disorientation, unable to reliably state the current year, not a candidate for independent decision-making at this time. Renee read that note out loud to me twice, right there in her office, just to make sure it had actually landed. A man who couldn't reliably tell a doctor what year it was had, according to Colton Fastener's own corporate file, signed away my future in a legally binding amendment that same afternoon. I called my father's younger sister, my Aunt Roberta, mostly because I needed to hear a voice that had known both my father and me for longer than the company had even existed. She told me something I hadn't expected. "Your father called me, maybe a year before the stroke," she said, "and told me he'd already made sure you were taken care of, no matter what Rick ever decided to do down the road. He never told me what he meant by it. I think I finally know now." Around that same week, Carol called again. The group from Cleveland, she'd learned from an accountant friend of hers, was a company called Meridian Industrial Holdings, and they were in the final stages of buying Colton Fastener and Supply outright for something close to $14 million, with a closing date roughly 8 weeks out. Renee looked across her desk at me and said something I still think about most days. "Meg, a sale that size does not close with a cloud sitting on the ownership. If your letter is real, and it is, somebody at that bank is going to find it whether we ever bring it up or not." She was right, and it happened faster than either of us expected. Meridian's due diligence team pulled every corporate document Colton Fastener had ever filed or referenced, all the way back to the founding, which is standard procedure for a deal that size, and somewhere in an old set of board minutes from 30 years earlier, a line referencing the equity letter and my name surfaced. That is how Paula Simmons found me, not because Rick told her, not because I had filed a single thing against him, because my own brother's hunger to sell the company he'd inherited, for a number with 7 zeros after it, cracked open the exact door he had spent 7 quiet years trying to keep shut. Rick spent all that time making absolutely sure I never learned what my father truly believed I was worth, and the one thing he couldn't control was his own bank asking a routine question about who legally owned 24% of the thing he was about to sell. When Paula called me that Thursday in May, she wasn't accusing me of a thing. She was just doing her job. "Is there any unresolved claim tied to this document from 30 years ago?" she asked. "Because if there is, we cannot recommend closing until it's addressed." I told her the truth. There was. I did not file a lawsuit. I did not call Rick screaming. And honestly, by that point in the spring, I didn't even want to. Renee sent one letter, addressed to Rick and to Colton Fastener's outside counsel, laying out the facts in plain, unhurried language. The letter from 30 years ago. The hospital note from 7 years ago. The amendment signed the same day. My father couldn't reliably state the year. She requested exactly 3 things. An independent valuation of my vested 24%. Back distributions for the years I should have received them. And a written correction to my personnel file, removing any reference to poor performance that had quietly been circulating without my knowledge. Nothing about revenge. Nothing about punishment. Just the plain math of what one document said, sitting next to the plain fact of what a doctor had written down in real time, with no honest way for anyone to argue around either one. 2 days later, for the first time in 61 days, my phone rang. It was Rick. His voice had a brightness in it I hadn't heard directed at me in years. "Meg, hey, listen. We should talk. There's this whole misunderstanding. I really think we can clear it up fast. There's some paperwork timing that's a little sensitive right now." I let him talk for almost a full minute before I said anything at all. Then I asked him, "Is this about the sale to Meridian?" Silence. The kind of silence that answers a question all by itself. "How do you even know about that?" he asked. I told him the truth. Their underwriter had called me directly. Not him. Not our mother. A total stranger from a bank in Columbus was the first person in 61 days who thought to ask if I was all right. And really, she was only asking about a spreadsheet. He tried a few more angles over the following days. Family. Loyalty. Dad wouldn't want this. We can figure this out between us without lawyers getting involved. I told him, "Rick, Dad already figured it out. 30 years ago. And somebody had him sign his name over it 3 weeks after his stroke, while he couldn't tell a doctor what year it was. That's not a family conversation anymore. That's a medical record. We didn't meet at a courthouse." Renee arranged a quiet mediation session at her own firm. No press, no drama, exactly the way she'd said it needed to go if we wanted it resolved before Meridian's closing date. Rick showed up with Gordon Pruitt, who looked about 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him at a Christmas party. Renee laid 3 documents on the conference table in order: the original letter, the hospital record, and the amendment with my father's shaking signature, the way you'd lay out a set of blueprints for someone who kept insisting the building had been built a different way. She never raised her voice once. "This amendment is not enforceable," she said. "And any sale that closes without correcting the ownership structure exposes your buyer to a claim they will absolutely find eventually because they already found it once." Rick looked at those 3 pages for a long time. Then he looked up at me, and for just a second, I saw something that might have been the boy who used to let me ride on the back of his bike before either of us understood what that company was eventually going to cost us both. "I needed the deal to close clean, Meg," he said quietly. "I had debt tied up in the house, in Bradley's boat, in things I hadn't told anyone about. I needed it clean. I didn't answer that. There wasn't anything in it that actually needed a response from me. 3 weeks later, we signed a settlement. An independent appraisal valued my share at just over $3,100,000, paid out at closing, along with 7 years of back distributions Colton Fastener should have been paying me since the amendment was signed. My personnel file was formally corrected. Meridian's deal closed on schedule, only 6 days later than originally planned. My father, when Renee gently walked him through all of it on one of his clearer afternoons at Marion Meadows Memory Care, sat quietly for a long moment. Then he looked right at me and said, "I always meant for you to have it. I just never figured out how to say that to your brother without breaking something between us." I told him it was all right. I'm not sure either of us fully believed that, but it was the truest thing either of us had to offer that particular afternoon. My mother called me the week after the settlement closed, crying, apologizing for the 61 days, for choosing comfort over courage more times than either of us wants to count out loud. I told her I understood why she'd been scared. I didn't tell her it was completely all right, because it wasn't. Not yet, and maybe not ever entirely, but we talk most weeks now, and for the time being, that has to be enough for both of us. Rick and I are civil. We're not close. Patricia stopped including me on the family emails the week the settlement closed, and honestly, I've stopped noticing when they stop coming, the same way you eventually stop noticing a radiator once the room's already warm without it. I used part of the settlement to start a small consulting practice, helping mid-sized manufacturers modernize their floor operations, the kind of work I have always genuinely loved, done on my own schedule for the first time in 26 years. Carol Jennings works alongside me now, 3 days a week, handling the books, the same steady hands that mailed me copies of emails from a phone number I didn't recognize. My daughter Claire and my son Nathaniel never once stopped answering my calls, not for a single one of those 61 days, and I try to remember, especially on the harder afternoons, that the family that actually shows up was never the one I spent 58 years trying to earn a seat at. My father has good days and difficult ones now. On the good days, I bring him coffee and we sit by the window at the facility, and he tells me about the two-bay garage on Foundry Street like it happened last month instead of nearly 6 decades ago. I've stopped waiting for him to say he's proud of me out loud in front of anyone else. That letter already said it, in his own handwriting, 30 years before Rick ever had the chance to argue with it. Here's what I understand now that I didn't understand the day those 2 guards watched me carry 4 boxes to my truck in the rain. Some people only remember you exist the moment they realize you're sitting on something they need. Silence isn't always cruelty. Sometimes it's fear, wearing a very quiet coat. And the loudest kind of justice I've ever witnessed didn't come from a courtroom or a scene at a family dinner table. It came from one honest letter, written 30 years before anybody needed it, that simply refused to stop being true. That's my story. 61 days of silence, one honest letter from 30 years ago, and a phone call from a stranger who was only doing her job. If this is the kind of story you needed today, tell me in the comments below. And here's the question I keep sitting with. If your family only picks up the phone the moment they realize you're worth something, would you still answer? Where would you draw that line and why? Type it below. I read every single one. This has been Dark Revenge, where the quiet ones keep the receipts. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and I'll see you there.